All right, we're going to be talking about a subject called the art of memory. Before we get to that, because it is a vast subject, and I want to provide tonight, if I'm not too ambitious, something of an introduction to it. Tim and I have talked about it in the past. It's something that he first told me about way back when I was a lad of 19 years of age. And that started this whole odyssey of looking into all kinds of different aspects of the art of memory, where it comes from, how it evolved across time in our culture. My attempts to find parallel examples in other cultures, and where I've had success, where I have not been so successful. We're going to get to that, but before we do, I want to make a couple of quick announcements. One of them is, please check to make sure you're subscribed. YouTube has just gone into another one of its furious fits of unsubscribing people on my channel without their knowledge. I've noticed a bunch of people coming back in. I see it in my notifications when somebody resubscribes, and I'm like, I know that name. They subscribed a long time ago. I sometimes see them in the chat. What are they doing resubscribing now? So clearly folks are being booted. Check that and resubscribe if you've been unsubscribed without your knowledge. Next thing, there is an alternate channel here on YouTube, and the way things are going, it might well be necessary that I jump over to it if I get some kind of content strikes over here. If that happens, just make sure you are signed up to the alternate channel, A Safer Space, and then there are analogs for both, Semiagog and A Safer Space over on BitChute. I'm also on Minds, on Gab. There's a Discord server, Twitter, and I was on Mastodon for a while, but the particular server I was on was being run by a real asshole, so I just dropped out of it. Also, the interface was kind of hard to follow. So anyway, there's that. Another announcement is that there will be an upcoming clip on the House, in the sort of what I hope will be the House series, the House as a cultural technology. As a matter of fact, what we're going to talk about tonight relates quite a bit to that, in ways that will hopefully become apparent to everyone as we proceed. But there will be a new clip coming up on the House. It's not going to be a live stream. I just need to shoot it. I have all my notes ready, and I'm set to go, but I had some friends in visiting, and that took up the last couple days. And the focus of that House clip will be intergenerational dialogue and foster parenting, sort of from the perspective of Western traditions and what sort of stuff we can, chew on based on our history with all of that. But that's coming up. What else? I think I've covered it. Resubscribe if you've been booted. Subscribe to the alternate channels or follow on Twitter and the rest. And there's an upcoming clip on the House. Okay. Now we're going to be talking about a subject that involves all kinds of books and reading. I'm just going to run them by you real quick here on screen. When we get to the end of this, after I've given you an introduction, we'll go into the titles of these books. These are kind of like further reading type things for people who might be interested. All kinds of stuff in here. Yes, indeed. We have Craft of Thought should come first. Yes. Mind of a Nemist and Buddhist Memory. But we're going to come back to that after we do the introduction. So for those who are willing and able to hang through this entire presentation, there will be some discussion at the end of further reading for those who have an interest in learning more about all of what we're going to go over tonight. I see we've got some people in the house. I'm going to be focusing on talking now and trying not to be a total disconnected asshole, so forgive me if I don't catch everybody who comes in subsequently, but I do want to give a shout out to Mr. Ixme, one of our moderators, and Philosophicat. I hope I didn't say that incorrectly. I imagine I probably did. Oh, good Lord, Tim's in the house. Oh, no pressure. Shit. Okay. And the Great Order as well. Who else do we have here? Zedez and others, welcome all. So how does this all work? How do we start this? Well, we have to remember that once upon a time, we did not have things like pieces of paper that we could scribble notes down on. In point of fact, we didn't even have writing, arguably, during the period when these techniques first emerged. At least that case can be argued, depending on when you pin down the origins. And it's very important that we do remember things. Imagine, that you want to keep track of your family, right? Over time, the various generations and how it might have formed alliances with other families. Or imagine that you're sending a whole string of donkeys up across the mountains to a neighboring city-state, and you want to remember what you're going to sell, what you're going to get in return. Imagine that you want to get up and give a speech in front of a group of people. And that's the basis of convincing them, because they didn't have telephones, right? And arguably, even if writing was around when these techniques first came into use, the majority of the population was not literate. And so you have a situation where you have to remember things. And as I said, you don't have a sheet of paper and a pencil. It's possible that they didn't even have palimpsests, the waxed tablet and the stylus that they used as sort of the equivalent of a notepad, to say nothing of things like, your cell phone or your thief of peace, your black mirror that you type little things into in order to try to remember what you need to do or have alarms go off and the rest. So obviously there was a need to remember things. And we're going to be talking about that and a number of techniques to make that possible or to facilitate it. But in the course of all of this, it's important to remember that when I talk about memory, the scope of what's under discussion is more broad. It's perhaps more than what we think of today as, our memory, in which there are things that we throw them in and we might draw them forth in some fashion. Some of us might have little mnemonic tricks we remember, like saying Roy G. Biv to remember the sequence of colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, that kind of thing. Or 30 days hath November, or something like that, if I'm not butchering it. They're little vestiges of these things, but we generally think of the memory as just a place where things go and maybe they come back. We don't generally think of our memory as being central to our character. And because of the massive secularization that has occurred in our various interrelated cultures, we certainly, most of us anyway, don't think of memory as being related to the soul. So character, soul, these things that are deeply, foundationally, primarily a part of you, one could argue in any case. So when we talk about memory, it's going to be a little bit more than just, oh, I forgot that I left my porch light on, or I left the garage door open. This is, it's a much broader subject, and I hope that it will become apparent how it is broader and why. So once upon a time, we didn't have writing. We didn't have these various tools. And even if we did, for the vast majority of people, it was not commonplace. Most people were not literate. And so how did one remember? Well, there is a tradition, and it runs all the way from ancient Greece all the way up through to the present day, where some of these techniques are referred to very superficially as the method of loci, right? In like mnemonic competitions where people, all get together once a year and they see who can remember the biggest sequence of things, or longest, I should say, sequence of things correctly without running into any trouble. But again, there's more to it than that. Anyway, that's just to bring it down to the current date. Once upon a time, way back when in ancient history, we begin to catch glimpses in the historical records, such as it is, because the record is kind of right on the verge of the appearance of alphabetic writing. Way back when, we can see the origins of all of this. So round about the early 5th century BC, so roughly like 490, somewhere in there, we have the first of the writings of, or 450, somewhere in there in the 5th century BC, we have the writings of Protagoras. He's an early Greek sophist. Now, this is a period in history for which we only have very fragmentary texts, little bits and pieces here and there that maybe somebody pulled off of a stone or cited in some other text. Aristotle was big for including citations of earlier writers, and many other authors from the ancient world were. So we don't have any kind of a full picture of that time, but we do have little hints and vestiges from the early 5th century that a new group of people in the Greek city-states that we today call Sophists were very into the art of memory. Sophists were big, not just for convincing you, as the trope goes today, that white is black and black is white. They were traveling teachers and philosophers who were known for being hired to share their knowledge with the public, or with, the children of noble families or whatever, to make them more effective out in the world. They were kind of teachers, but it was also like to help give you power. So it's kind of like how to win friends and influence people, kind of like Anthony Robbins, and kind of like having a live-in tutor. And these guys built their reputations by sharing their own unique, so they would have you believe, techniques for education and gaining skill in persuasion and argument and logic. So through the 5th century, we have little bits and pieces, little details here and there that we can see as first traces of this art of memory that we'll discuss. I'm going to pull one out now. This is in a book called The Older Sophists, and it includes texts from that period I'm talking about, including one of the, or the earliest one, and this is from the later 5th century. So this would be towards the end of the Peloponnesian War, roughly during the time period when Thucydides was alive. And this is from a text called the Disoi Logoi. I'm butchering the Greek pronunciation, but I'm sure none of you care. It's like they say about ancient Latin, the professor at Oxford, and someone asked him, I think it was Oxford or Cambridge, somebody asked him, how does one pronounce ancient Latin? And he said, with great authority, because no one can dispute it. Now, this story is also related in a book that will be necessary for all of those who want to learn more, The Art of Memory by Francis Yates. But I'll read it to you here from the edited by Rosamond Kent Sprague, Older Sophists volume. And this is just a tiny little vestige we have. The greatest and fairest discovery has been found to be memory. It is useful for everything, for wisdom as well as for the conduct of life. This is the first step. If you focus your attention, your mind making progress by this means will perceive more. The second step is to practice whatever you hear. If you hear the same things many times and repeat them, what you have learned presents itself to your memory as a connected whole. The third step is, whenever you hear something, connect it with what you know already. For instance, suppose you need to remember the name Chrysippos. You must connect it with chrysos, gold, and hippos, horse. Or another example, if you need to remember the name Pyrilampes, you must connect it with pyr, fire, and lampein, to shine. These are examples for words. In the case of things, do this. If you want to remember courage, think of Ares and Achilles. Or metalworking, think of Hephaestus. Or cowardice, of Epeios. So this is a thing that Frances Yates, a great scholar of this, points out in her pioneering book from back in the 60s, I believe. There is a distinction here in this earliest of clear references to the art of memory, a distinction between memory for words and memory for things. Now, as we move forward in time and we take a look at the idea of the art of memory in ancient Greece, the art of memory in ancient Rome, there's a further distinction, which is the difference between artificial memory and natural memory. So think about memory for words and memory for things, artificial memory and natural memory. And bear in mind, artificial does not so much carry this connotation of fake, or even man-made in the sense of fake, or what we generally think of as artificial. It's more about arts, artes, techne, the systematic application of human knowledge to come up with ways of doing things that are methodical and that can be built upon by subsequent generations because they're not arbitrary. Because they're systematic and methodical, various people can contribute to the development of the art or of the techniques, if you will. So artificial is like man-made in the sense of a systematic body of knowledge, not man-made in the sense of fake so much as we think about it today. Now, there is a natural memory, that is counterposed against this artificial memory. I will tease out some little aspects of the natural memory just a bit tonight, though we'll be talking a lot about the artificial memory. Tim is someone qualified to speak at length on the natural memory, while I am not. I can point at the gateways to where it begins and some of my own glimpses of things that might be related to that place, the place wherein natural memory is experienced, if one can imagine it as being distinct from any other place. But I'll be talking about both, primarily though, the artificial memory. So now we know that there's this systematic body of knowledge from the ancient world that we first see evidence of, clear evidence of, in terms of the same techniques that are recapitulated over time in the 5th century BC during a period of these wandering wise men, and also on the very edges of the emergence of alphabetic writing in Greece. Now, there was an earlier alphabet, linear B, that's from sometime around, 1000 BC, 1200 BC, somewhere in there, and it was used to write Greek for sure. We know that because of a great guy named Michael Ventris, an amateur who decoded it, translated it, if you will. But it disappeared for a time, and it only reemerged in maybe the 8th century. I think there's some clay object somebody found that seems to have a few letters on it, but the writing system doesn't really begin to appear and get used until the 6th century. And then, by the time of the 5th century, a couple hundred years into some widespread use of writing, we start to hear about this art of memory. And that's interesting because it was definitely in use before writing became widespread in the ancient world. Some people would have had writing, but there would have been all kinds of people who had to have another way to remember. Now, there are things like, tally marks. There are things like icons and emblems. All of this is kind of tied to the subject, but I'm going to have to kind of take that chunk and set it off to one side. You can find out more about that in a 3-part video grouping on the mark. And in fact, some of the stuff that we'll be discussing tonight can be tied to one of those videos called Memory Mark, but there's Beast Mark and Memory Mark and another one. Anyway, round about the 5th century, start to see evidence of this. And then by the time of Aristotle and Plato, roughly that period when, just before and during the period when Alexander the Great comes online, we have mentions of it that talk about memory for words and memory for things. And we can see that there is a tradition kind of coming out of what we saw with the Sophists of the citizens, the higher ranking citizens, the ones who would want to have power, who would want to be able to speak, to employ rhetoric before groups of men to sway them, who would need to, because that was the method of addressing the public. They were getting taught rhetoric, and the art of memory was a part of rhetoric. And there was a systematized teaching of it. So it kind of comes out of the tradition of the Sophists, when each of these different guys, based on the power of their personality, and the standing of those who they got to hire them, would sort of build their own school. Over time, it got systematized, and more people began to use a number of aspects of it in common. So it becomes a part of the tradition of rhetoric, and it would have been taught in Greece in the important schools of rhetoric, such as you had at Athens. And the idea is essentially this. It is that you use physical buildings to organize space, and you place objects within those buildings in order to remember the things you wish to remember. And the order of the space in which the objects are positioned lends order to the concepts. Now, when I say a physical building, I should actually correct that. You've got analogs of physical buildings in the mind. So the ancient teachers of rhetoric would say, okay, you're a new student. What you need to do is set up some memory schemata, set up some sort of arrangement in the mind that you will use to order the images of memory. So one recommendation that's given is that students of rhetoric go out to some part of the city at night or some important building where they have access, but to go at night when it's empty and quiet, and to walk around the building memorizing its every part. And over time, by repeating that process, to come up with an analog of the building in the mind that is fixed and stable, and it becomes the space, the foundation upon which one will write, in quotes, using the images. And so the places are called loci. That's plural for Latin locus, which is the source of our word location. And within these loci, these various locations, they would place imagines, images that represent knowledge or the content of a speech or facts that needed to be recalled. And so the idea was, once one put this structure in the memory, it would be present forevermore. Now, it required repetition to a certain extent. Even as early as the 5th century BC with the Sophist material, we see that they talk about repetition, which we call learning by heart. The reason we associate it with the heart is because of a kind of a detour that the art of memory took during the Middle Ages, when, because of the scientific knowledge of the time and the way in which the empirical and scientific had not yet been divided from religion and spirituality and the rest, it was believed that the organ of memory was the heart. But here I go off on another tangent. So the idea was that you would repeat to yourself this process of fixing the image in the mind, and the stability of the primary image, which lends order, is what would lock in and make lasting the impressions that you wanted to hold in your memory. So just to illustrate this a little bit more, say that, think about your own house while we're sitting here right now, and think about your front door, because in all likelihood your home has a front door, unless it's just been kicked in or your house is burned down. So you know that you have a place where you begin the sequence of entering your house, and it's at your door. Now, your house is a space that you have moved through many times, and you know the layout of it. It shouldn't be hard for you right now to close your eyes as I'm speaking and walk up to the front door of your house, and you should be able to look left and look right in this virtual space within you and see what's on either side. You can open the door and walk in, and you have an understanding of whether or not there's an atrium there, or an entrance hallway. Perhaps there are coat hooks on the wall. Perhaps there's a set of staircases running upwards. You know, there are further doors opening into different rooms. Now, you should, in your mind, be able to walk through the parts of your house. Now, in the course of doing that, imagine that you place images that you want to use to remember things. You place them along the route that you're traveling. You drop them there. Now, these images lock in the content that you wish to remember. So let's say you're going to give a speech and you have the inside of your house memorized. Well, you've placed images in a sequence inside your house. When you go to give the speech and you're looking at your audience, you wouldn't do that crap that, you know, modern politicians do, where they have a little piece of paper in front of them and they read to you as though they actually feel what they're saying. You know, they're entirely unconvincing. They're talking heads. In the ancient world, that would not be tolerated. A rhetor reading from a piece of paper would literally be laughed out of the Senate or wherever it was he was addressing people. So you had to have it in your mind. Now, you place the images are in sequence. And by in sequence, I mean that if you know you're going to walk in the door and turn left, and you're going to walk through the living room and into the kitchen, well, as you go into the first room, you've got an image placed there to remind you of the first thing that you want to talk about. You turn left and go into the living room, and there's a second image there. Perhaps there's a third on the threshold between the living room and the kitchen. Then when you get into the kitchen, there's yet another image. Now, in the ancient world, you might have had that being the Temple of Artemis. That was the sequence. And as you walked around the outside with its columns or whatever, you would people it with images or however you do it. In this case, I'm just using the example of the house. Also, it seems likely, if not certain, that people used imagined places as a basis for memorizing things. So you have the idea of someone giving a speech, and they're checking out those images as they move in sequence past the various locations, and that lends order to what they're talking about. But how is it that we make these images stick in our mind? We've talked about the loci, the various locations, and we've talked about how that had to be solidly fixed. That thing had to be rock solid, because that was the foundation that held everything else. If you couldn't remember the place, then you didn't have any order. And it's almost like that when the building in your mind fades or gets washed away, or as they used to use as a metaphor in the ancient world, is like runny wax. You try to stamp it with your seal ring or whatever, and the wax is too soft, so it runs and smears. They refer to the memory as being like wax. Or you could say that the wax is too hard. You try to mash it with your seal ring and it just won't take an impression in the first place. If your physical structure, in quotes, within your mind gets washed away, then what of the objects? Well, if you have the solid structure, great. Now, how do you remember the objects? How do you make sure that they're striking? And these ancient texts on memory, most particularly the later ones that we have from the Latin period, which are preserved in Cicero and Quintilian, and the Pseudo-Ciceronian Ad Herennium, another text on rhetoric. From these things, particularly the Ad Herennium, we know that the images were supposed to be emotionally striking. Actually, I should say only from the Ad Herennium. I don't think the true Ciceronian in De Oratore or in Quintilian they touch on this. They talk about an anchor to remember seafaring shit, or a sword to remember warfare, and they talk about physical structures, but it's only in the Ad Herennium that they talk about the emotional impact of the image. Now, this is an important thing to recognize for all these sets of techniques. If I'm walking down the street, on Monday, and I happen to pass a guy who's just kind of nondescript in a gray suit with a tie, and it's just kind of blah, it's not going to make an impression on my memory. It's not likely that, even 15 minutes later, even 5 minutes later, that I will be able to tell you that I passed that guy and what the context was and what was going on. On the other hand, if I'm walking down the street and suddenly a tractor trailer comes screaming past me and slams into a guy in a clown suit and then smears him across a wall, like someone just sneezed blood on brick, that's going to stick in my memory. It's a striking memory image because it has emotional power. You have the idea of pathos and the horror of the thing happening, not to mention this bright color scarlet. We know that we have color vision because primates, have to identify the fruit up in the branches, like, for 100 different reasons. The rarity of the occurrence, the horror of the occurrence, the literal colorfulness of the experience means that it's something that's striking and it sticks, so to speak, in the mind's eye. So we know we have locations and we know we have images, and the images are placed in sequence in those locations, and the images should be emotionally striking. You talk about, if you read, I think you'll find it in Homer, most likely you will. If you won't, you'll find it in other ancient writers. The idea is that Ares travels together with Eris, who is discord. So war, or Ares, comes, and in his train is Eris, who's discord, and Phobos for terror, and these other figures. So these are images that we read about in mythology, but none of us think about the art of memory aspect, where there's, we just personified it in that way. Well, yes, we did personify it, which is to make it into an image, but there was a whole set of techniques surrounding these emotionally striking images and how they would form the elements of an ordered memory. And this is where what I was talking about earlier becomes important. I was like, this isn't just about remembering, the how many days each month has, or the sequence of colors in the rainbow, because it's not just this vague thing, memory. The idea is that the memory is the soul peopled with imagery that comes from experience. Or if you're a Platonist, there are sort of archetypal images, and if you're an Aristotelian, it's peopled as a result of experience, and perhaps these two things are not mutually exclusive, but we don't have time to go into all of that. What I'm getting at is that it's not just a matter of remembering the image of warfare and that in its train comes discord and terror. It's not just remembering the virtues and vices. It's the fact that you shape your soul with this order, which means you have an ordered soul. It's like an ordered garden. in which weed images are ripped up by their roots and beautiful ones are planted, which is where we get the idea of the memory as a garden, a hortus, which is, a whole tradition of its own. Maybe we'll come back to here in a bit. But by forming one's memory, ordering it, and populating it with images that are useful, that become a foundation for making ethical decisions, we can see that whole dimension that I mentioned at the outset, which is this is the soul, this is the psyche. The memory is one experiential facet of the soul itself. So this was taught as a form of rhetoric, and it would give people power to address the audience and to remember one's elements. Or if you were in an argument with someone, on the other side of the Senate floor, and they raised like 6 points to refute you, because you had an ordered space in your memory, as each point was mentioned, you could populate an empty room in your memory, so to speak. And it wasn't a matter of, can I remember what he said so I can refute it point by point? Yeah, you can, because you just look over in the room. The room's not going anywhere. You've been memorizing it for 20 years, and you just placed 6 emotionally striking images in that room. So how could you forget them? One is a guy who's naked, covered in blue paint with a set of ram's horns. Another one is a guy that's taking an example from the Ad Herenium, who's got like a ring on one finger, and it's of ram's testicles. And from the ram's testicles ring, we are to remember the Latin word testes for testicles, but also for the root of our term to testify, so we can remember that there were 2 witnesses, right? Things like that. It seems like it's all over the place, but this was a foundation of how people operated. And the principle, the ontological foundation and the epistemological foundations for all of this, verging as they did into epistemology and theology, in the sense that we're talking about the soul, was that this is how the mind naturally worked, that there was a natural memory. So even if we weren't doing this artificially by creating buildings in the mind and populating them with images, it would be happening anyway. And that is the natural memory. That is the idea, or that is one path of approach to what is called the natural memory. And it has to do with the idea that the immediate result of our experiences within the soul is the formation of interior gardens and landscapes. The idea of the Christos saying the kingdom of God is within you, it's almost as though the little point of ego awareness has been locked into the groove of a record player, and as it winds through and vibrates and produces this sound from this self-aware egocentric position that allows me to think of myself as a subject, experiencing all this stuff that exists objectively, this idea of standing apart, having a reflexive self-awareness. Our interior is populated as a result of our experience of things. Because we live in the world, we experience space. And so space, so to speak, is written or reflected and even has the potential to come to life within us. Now that's over in the land of the natural memory. I can't really go into it in an ordered way with this. I still have to cover the basics of the artificial memory and the history of all of this, but that is an important little path, a needle threading little path running off to one side. So for those who wish to take it in future, recognize that it's there. It runs off to one side of this whole subject, underpins it, and arcs above it. Okay, so we have the idea of how this memory, this ordered memory, formed by education and peopled with cultural knowledge like the pantheon of the gods and the virtues and vices, aspects of human experience that become personified as memorial or imaginal content within. We know that rhetors, who were supposed to be able to deal with the affairs of men, were trained in this. Well, this happens through ancient Greece. It happens up through ancient Rome. People like, Demosthenes, or you have Aristotle talking about it in De Memoria et Reminiscentia, I think, if I'm not screwing up the Latin version of the title. Because, of course, Aristotle's work in the Middle Ages was traveling in a Latin form, having been translated. in that period from where it had survived in the Greek among Byzantines and in Arab sources. So it moves up through Greece, it moves up through ancient Rome. It's fundamental to education because anyone who is going to be anybody should have an education in rhetoric, because they would have to address people. They would be, wearing the hat of power within their society in some fashion or another, whether for a short time or a long time, or maybe only in potential, but they had to know. So it was a fundamental aspect of education. But then you had the fall of the ancient world and the emergence of the period that we call medieval. Now, there's some important transitional figures there for the art of memory. We don't just have Quintilian and Cicero and the Ad Horennium and then nothing until we get to the medieval period when, where the Christianity has become a major theme. We've got some transitional ones. There's Macrobius, there's Martianus Capella, foundational educational texts in late antiquity when the whole Christian thing was just about to come online or was coming online. You also have, figures from late antiquity who were early Christians. So you have a figure like Boethius, the Consolation of Philosophy. I believe Tim, who, if he has any sense, he's not still here, but if he's still listening to this, as I recall, he's rereading that probably for the 100th time. When I last talked to him, he mentioned that. So you got Boethius with the Consolation of Philosophy. And there, you have, as I recall, it's the Muses, is it, who are standing around the bed of the would-be philosopher Boethius as he's bemoaning his state, and reason personified as the figure of this woman who bustles in and drives out the Muses that she calls whores, slatterns, whatever, women who have no business crowding around the bedside of a philosopher who should be approaching things with reason. That's an early Christian figure that is clearly using the images as a foundation for making a Christian argument, but it's a fundamentally pagan approach. And see, that's another important thing to remember as you move from the situation of the ancient world, where you have big cities and reasonable stability in terms of social institutions and the rest. There's not the great upheaval as much as you saw with waves of barbarian invasions and the fall of Rome, as they call it. During that period, it was much more likely that you have huge numbers of people together, and so the art of memory would be applied to public speaking and images. And so, like I said, you have the image of Ares, and Ares comes with Eris, who's discord, and Phobos as terror. But when you ceased to be addressing huge crowds of people verbally, what ended up happening is we started moving to text-based traditions with the emergence of Christianity and the decline of antiquity. And that's not surprising because Christianity has a heavy influence from Judaism, and that's a textual religion. With the ancient Greeks, I talked to Tim about this a lot. It's not like you have a Bible in the ancient Greek world. I mean, there are vestiges, there are religious texts that seem to survive in some sense. You've got, Apuleius with the golden ass, and, there's a lot in there that describes what goes on with the devotees of Isis, as I recall. So, you hear there are texts that talk about what was going on in the religions of the ancient world, but it's not like they were based on a text. They were based on temples and objects, tripods and statues, or the image of Athena, where the most highly skilled women with the nimblest fingers, who are the finest weavers or embroiderers, would yearly come together and spend a time apart weaving the new garments for the goddess, because those statues were painted and clothed. They weren't naked white marble as we see them today. So when you try to think about the art of memory and how it was tied to the classical world or antiquity, given that antiquity was populated by imagery to an extent that most of us don't really get, there's a whole lot more going on there in terms of the full culture. But what I'm getting at is that it was not so much textual. But with the arrival of Christianity and textual traditions, the idea of a sacred text, a text that grows over time and becomes this body of knowledge, the techniques of the art of memory began to be applied to written composition. and to writing sermons, because there still was the idea of addressing large groups of people. But instead of someone like Cicero arguing with somebody else over the Catiline conspiracy, instead you would have a priest or an abbot up in front of a group of people making an argument for why one particular doctrinal point was to be preferred over another, or the ethics of a given thing and whether or not behavior was right or wrong, pleasing or not in the eyes of God. So this art of memory that once had to do with rhetoric, and as I teased a little bit, had to do with temple structure and imagery that we saw everywhere, even the images on coins, all kinds of other stuff, and probably dance moves and a whole host of other things. The art of memory moves into textual traditions, and it becomes a part of sermons and religious texts. And that's where it hits Christianity. Now, in the Christian tradition, except for odd little moments here and there, like the whole movement of iconoclasm in Eastern Christendom, or the Reformation, where the Protestants come in and decide that all images should be kicked out, except for situations like those, circumstances like those, historical actualities like those. For the most part, you had a lot of room to use imagery in the Christian world. And so you have the idea of virtues and vices. Tim likes to talk a lot. He introduced me to it, about the psychomachia of Prudentius and the way in which it's a war for the soul of man. And the virtues and vices are fighting in order to dominate. And you've got little stories like, this is the one we always tap on just because it's so lovely. You know, avarice enters the camp of the virtues disguised as thrift. You know, you've got different figures of the virtues and vices. You've got the classical virtues, the cardinal ones. And what is that? That's prudence and fortitude and justice and, good God, temperance. Right? These are the cardinal virtues, but they're shown, they have images for each of them. And that is tied to the art of memory. You have the Pauline virtues, or the theological ones. So spes, fides, and caritas, faith, hope, and charity. And the 4 and the 3 get put together to form the 7 virtues. And eventually they come up with the idea of 7 vices, counterposed against them. But in reality, there were far more than that. I mean, just under gluttony, you had the idea of ventris ingluvis, which I think meant like windy gut. You know, the idea of always eating too much and farting and being swollen and bloated by your gluttony. You could split these images and divide them as much as necessary, as far as you wanted to achieve whatever degree of granularity you wanted to. And in speaking to people, whether it's in a sermon or earlier from figures in ancient Rome, bringing the images in the mind of the listener to life by accurately representing the ones in your own mind became a technique. And that runs into Renaissance Hermeticism and what could be called sorcery or magic, which we're now coming up on. I do want to touch on just a few things in this whole Christian period, because I just shot way over it. There's a whole bunch, before we get to the Renaissance material, there's a whole lot going on here. I mean, just an enormous amount going on in this area. And this is the area where you want to look at Mary Carruthers. Again, we're going to look at these books at the end. Ivan Illich, tons of it, tons in the medieval period that deserves a lot of attention, certainly a lot more attention than it's currently getting. Where to start? You have the idea of images of virtues and vices in the medieval period, as I talked about. You have, figures like reason showing up and driving out the muses in the consolation of philosophy. You've got Hugh of St. Victor. You've got Richard of St. Victor. You've got even much later things like St. Teresa of Avila. You've got St. John of the Cross. It's literally everywhere. Text by Thomas Bradwardine. There's no shortage of examples of the art of memory in Christian literature, because something happened when the Judaic traditions of the text met the peoples of the West, if you will, and the idea that images were forbidden that you see, for example, in most forms of Judaism, as I understand it, and certainly in among all observant Muslims. You're not supposed to have imagery. It's a kind of idolatry. Again, leaving aside situations like the Reformation in Christianity or iconoclasm. What we did is we used texts as an adjunct, as another dimension of how to organize and populate and make lasting our memories. And that's embodied most perfectly in the idea of a page from an illuminated manuscript. We talk about the word rubric, under the rubric of. Rubric, the term comes from reference to red, the bright color red used for a capital letter on a page that would help us to remember. But on the page of that manuscript, that bright rubric, that letter, which might be a C for Shemira, because there's some text having to do with the Shemira, because they're talking about something from the classical world. Well, they would have the big C, but wrapped around the C would be the image of the Shemira. And so you would have in your memory the idea of a Shemira. And as soon as you thought of it, you'd see the picture wrapped around the letter C. And as soon as you saw the picture wrapped around the letter C, then you would be connected to the word Shemira itself. And Shemira itself would be the first link in the chain of the sequence of text. And so you would be able to pull up the image all the way from deep down wherever it was. And indeed, in Mary Carruthers' book, The Book of Memory, she took a medieval image of how the fish pulls up the fish from the guts of the fish. The idea is that there in the depths, all you would do is hook one of them, and because they were linked in a chain or a catena, you would be able to pull up all of it. And so you see what I mean, I hope, about how when the textual tradition of the Orient, Judaism specifically in this case, hammered into in the form of Christianity, hammered into the textual and imaginal traditions of the classical world, you see the two things being used together to yield a whole greater than the sum of its parts that has different opportunities inherent in it. So there's that bears consideration. There's the way in which text and memory overlap in the ordering of texts themselves that only appeared with scholasticism. So before people like Albertus Magnus and St. Thomas Aquinas, you didn't have indexes. You didn't really have chapters. I mean, you can look at books from late antiquity or the classical world, where original texts survive, as rare as they are, and you don't really even see punctuation. Or if you do, it's the most vestigial or simplest form of punctuation you can imagine. The sentences literally jammed together. And that's originally where the idea of quoting came from. A learned man in Christianity could quote a text, but to quote meant to separate the neat section. Now that's easy for us because we can look at it visually. If one writer is quoting another one, the paragraph will break and you'll have an open white space, and then you'll see maybe in a slightly different typeface or in italic or slightly smaller, you'll see the quote, and it's physically differentiated. And you can then quote it, or it will appear within distinguishing marks. Punctuation is a whole another dimension, not to mention shorthand, of how techniques from the art of memory crossed over with writing, and the image on the letter created even further opportunities for mnemonic fun. But those in history who could quote were those who had it in their memory, the text so fully and perfectly in their memory that not only could they run through that uninterrupted line without punctuation, but they were so good that they could quote, which is to cut out that section and hold it before you. They could quote the text, which means not just speaking that specific part, but the underlying aspect of being able to identify it, locate it, remember it correctly, and separate it and present it as its own little unit. So we didn't have chapters. We didn't have tables of content. We didn't have indices. And so this is the ordering aspect. What's really happening here is the text, which was sort of like an uninterrupted line, because you had the idea of recitation. When people were reading in the medieval world, it wasn't that they sat quietly with their little book and they just, I'm reading this by myself. No, you would be read to, and you would hear it spoken while you were eating in a monastery, for example. So that's another dimension to consider. There's so much more to books and reading and memory than anybody has any fucking idea of. It's like this whole forgotten the great irony, given that we're talking about the art of memory. It's this whole forgotten dimension of our culture and history. So in addition to these other medieval things, again, I want to jump over to the Renaissance here. And, I'm doing a disservice to all these different periods in history because I want to jump through them to give you an introduction. But I have to tap on a couple more things about the medieval period. One of them is that they developed a whole system having to do with what they called the intentio of the image. So we're not just talking about an image that we think of to remember. I did mention earlier that the image would be emotionally striking, the different imagines in their loci, right? That they would be emotionally striking because it helped you to remember them. But because of Christianity and the idea of, the importance of saving the soul and of right action in order to secure one's future in paradise and to avoid the torments of hell, that aspect of intentio of today we have the word intention, but it had more to do, that word had more to do in this context early on here with the idea of an emotional response to an image. And so it's easy to get from the classical idea of making it emotionally striking so you can remember it. So it makes an impression, back to the idea of the ring making an impression on wax, one of the oldest metaphors for memory in our textual traditions in the West. It was kind of an easy jump for Christians to think of an image as exciting an emotional response. So one could meditate upon an image of God that had within it an intentio of awe, and so one would be struck by awe while meditating on this image of the Almighty. Or one could, like the table of the 7 deadly sins with the eye of Christ at the center. I think it's in the Prado, done by Bosch. You see the 7 sins around the circumference of the table, and they create an emotional reaction in us. When we look at gluttony, it's disgusting. Now, that has to do with the Renaissance as well, and the idea of magic, of the sorcery of images. And we'll get to that in a minute, but do remember this idea of the image exciting an emotion. And it's the image of the rhetor, which gets imprinted with emotion during the time when that speaker or manipulator is internalizing the imagery. And then they speak eventually one day, and that image excites a response on the part of the audience, almost as though the emergence of the image within my soul, if it's emotionally striking enough, is like hitting a note, and they have a tuning fork out there in the audience that begins to vibrate in harmony with my emotional experience of my image, which can then trigger their emotional response, which means I can create emotions in them. Emotions. We have that word stimulus in Latin, which means cattle goad. We have kentron in Greek, which means cattle goad. We even have hormao, which is to sting forward or drive forward, which gives us hormones. The idea of these things, instinct, which comes from stimulus, sting, stick, to be goaded or prodded. Once we can kick off the emotions, because the emotions operate sub-rationally, we can stimulate a response in our audience. But here I am anticipating the whole Renaissance version of this. Let me just finish one last thing about the medieval period, which is that, and Tim was the one who pointed this out to me, and Carruthers, who we'll get to in the book review portion of this at the end, Carruthers goes into some of this, but they were building a memory palace within, and that memory palace was literally the structure of the knowledge, or I should say imaginally, but literally, as you understand me, it was the structure of the knowledge. So by building the rhetorical structure within that gave order to the memory, one would end up with a building in one's mind. It could even be a cross-shaped cathedral, and it would have different doors that were entered at different times, different seasons, different religious festivals. It's like when I was in Santiago de Compostela, I happened to arrive there visiting over there in Galicia on this 11-year cycle when a particular door got opened over there for pilgrims, and it would only happen for a short period once every 11 years. And as you approach that door, there are specific statues over that doorway. And they can be tied to biblical stories, teaching stories, or you might see, a gargoyle that's laughing as it drags a monk afflicted by the sin of curiositas down to hell, right? There are different images, all emotionally striking, all designed to motivate you to do some things and not do other things based on the culture that was trying to be promulgated by the Catholic Church. There are different routes and different images in each of those doorways. And our movement through space means that we encounter those images in a sequence. So essentially what's going on here, and again, Tim was the first one to ever tell me about this, they sought to externalize the art of memory. The lay people were not trained. They did not have trained memories. Their memories were a disordered mess, like a garden that had gone to weed. And in any case, they couldn't read and write. And even if they did, even if they could read and write in the vernacular, they didn't know Latin. So how were you going to share all of this with them? Well, you did it by physically externalizing it. And that is a thing that really does bear quite a bit of attention and motivation by everyone on this stream. The idea that these glorious edifices, your Notre Dame's, your beautiful, or there in Florence, the baptistry, these gorgeous buildings, they were designed to be externalizations of memorial structures. They existed first in the memory of the clergy, who then got together, particularly in the case of Gothic cathedrals and architecture, and they said, wow, what would happen if we took our memory palace and put it out here in the world with images at various locations and doorways associated with different things and processions and movements through space, surrounded by images in a sequence that gives order to our knowledge. When you look at a cathedral, you're looking at something that was first a memory palace and externalized in physical form for the lay people who otherwise would not have access to it, not having trained memories. That ties into some other things I talk about, I think, in my discussion with No White Guilt and the Great Order, in our discussion of the house, because I open up with some reference to the way in which, people are called architects of society, and you have the idea of Freemasons as builders who manipulate. Well, all across time, and in the Western tradition, going back to roots in the art of memory, we have built physical structures in order to shape the movement of peoples in very specific ways. Basically, after that medieval period, with that glorious efflorescence of externalized memory content that is Gothic art and architecture, then the Renaissance, a kind of tempered variation of that kind of opens like a funnel mouth towards a sudden explosion of syncretism, and then it shuts down through the period of the Enlightenment in terms of having any mystical dimension. And then finally, with people like Jeremy Bentham and the rest, and the great building programs of the 17th and 18th century, you see this more systematized secular approach to social engineering and architecture and the rest. And that's where that book, Buildings and Power, Freedom and Control, and the Origin of Modern Building Types, comes in. But once upon a time, our architecture was directly tied to the idea that we had a soul, and what we were looking at in that building was intentionally designed to be a representation of the ordered and harmonious and beautiful structures within the soul of one who was in and of, and individually a carrier of, that culture. So that's the medieval period. Well, then we've got this whole thing with the Renaissance, and there are a number of different variations that come in here. At the beginning, you have this heavy thing with syncretism. And for me, the big person who stands in my memory as an image representing the emergence of syncretism is Pico della Mirandola. And there's actually a great book, I haven't finished it yet, but I've read part of it, by Steve Farmer, and it's on Pico della Mirandola and Renaissance syncretism. But Pico was a student of Marsilio Ficino. Marsilio Ficino was a Florentine Neoplatonist who was in the employ of Cosimo de' Medici. And I think he survived over a little into the period of Lorenzo as well. And as I recall, he was hunchbacked or disfigured in some fashion. I visited his villa at Careggi in Florence when I was there in the 90s. Even though it wasn't a tourist destination, I managed to at least get into the gardens. They wouldn't let me walk through the building itself because I was thinking I'd find memorial artifacts in the architecture and imagery itself. Strange sculptures out in the garden of dwarves, little hunched dwarf figures, one of them riding on a snail and another one riding on the back of an owl. I took photos of those prints once upon a time. Pico della Mirandola was a student of Marsilio Ficino. Marsilio Ficino kind of marks the first perfect blush of what came to be the Renaissance. You know, it hit in waves, you know, first in Italy as we understand it, then in France, then in the Low Countries and in Germany, and finally in Britain, and had all these, you know, wild effects in each of the places that it manifests as that sort of unfolding occurred. The thing is that Marsilio Ficino had an interest in Renaissance Hermeticism. And you can look into Yeats for this, but basically the idea was that they had incorrectly assumed that the Hermetic texts were equally as old, if not older, than the early Christian texts. And so they had this whole theoretical way of explaining that these guys were like people who foreshadowed the coming of the Christ, that Hermes Trismegistus was in fact one of the Prisci Theologi, one of these early pagans that was virtuous and was only missing the revelation that came with Christ. But by introducing Hermeticism, that meant that Marsilio Ficino's great revival in the form of translations of ancient texts and of gathering people around him like Lorenzo Alberti, Pico himself, many others who were each of them famous in their own right. That meant that by bringing in Hermeticism and teaching the people around him about it, when he recreated antiquity, he threw in this huge swath of Neoplatonism and magic that maybe wasn't, at least in that form, original to the earlier period he thought it came from. Which means the art of memory became inextricably wound up with magic and imaginal manipulation. Now, Pico, as I mentioned with the whole thing with syncretism, he was attempting to reconcile things that he learned going blind at night, studying Kabbalah, studying what they knew about Zoroastrianism, studying Jewish scripture, older Christian scripture, what little bit of Greek he could get his hands on and get people to help him translate, all these sorts of things. So you get syncretism coming in. And so in some respects, that whole period of history is much like the Hellenic world, where all these pieces kind of get put together because they loosely fit. You have these archetypal categories that overlap to a considerable extent. And you get the introduction of Kabbalistic magic, probably some things that we no longer have records of or recognize as such, but parallel traditions, because the Kabbalists were not the only ones. There's a whole lot that smacks of Kabbalistic teaching, but that is not Jewish at all, that you find in heterodox esoteric Shiism. And you have to turn to Henri Corbin for discussions of that. But what I'm going to focus on here, I mean, you have all the other things. You have the idea of images standing for things in Renaissance art and architecture. It's almost as though you get a more self-conscious application of a number of these traditions. You know, there's a great book, again, one Tim introduced me to in the past, that's Studies in Iconology by Edgar Wind, that lays into some of this imagery. You know, for example, some of Botticelli's paintings, you know, other things. And you can find out more about how the art of memory informed that period. Another one is everybody should take a look at anyway, and I forgot to even put it in this pile of books. So I've mentioned it before, though. It's Ioan Culianu's Eros and Magic in the Renaissance. So jumping over to the idea of magic, following Pico and standing on the shoulders of Nicholas of Cusa, who'd come before him, and some of the stuff on memory by Albertus Magnus and Aquinas, and other folks that are laid out in not only The Art of Memory by Francis Yates, but also Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition by Francis Yates. You get the emergence of this guy, Giordano Bruno, and his system is the idea of the man who has power with the art of memory as a master manipulator. Basically, the idea of all that stuff I mentioned about how I'm the rhetor and I want to create repugnance in my audience by discussing the image of greed. Well, the first thing that needs to happen is I need to activate that image of greed within me. Well, those of you who have studied Hermeticism know that there's this idea of statues, these astral images. They're called statues, but the idea is that they're on some other plane or susceptible to a different set of rules that are not entirely material, and that these images precede Neoplatonically, with the whole idea of emanations, any more granular manifestation of the more universal thing they represent. So the rhetor would try to form the image of greed in his mind. We have the idea of intentio, which is a twofold thing. One, that the image should be memorable because it's emotionally striking, but as a consequence, the idea that when the image is reactivated within you, it brings back the emotion that goes with it, which means it's a way for you to turn on a set of emotions, like what would make an actor cry, like our friend Jussie Smollett, right? He doubtless, when he began to snivel and slobber, he pulled up some image that made him get all teary-eyed. And it was probably something other than being sprayed in the face with mace. But to take a more esoteric view of that, if you will, the operator, who is the rhetor, the one with the trained memory, who can call up the images, and by doing so call up the emotional reaction within themselves. Well, Neoplatonism also has the idea of all things being connected. The idea that there are certain influences with these emanations from the archetypal down to the granular and the merely real that are secret sets of correspondences and sympathies in the world of man. And so by raising the image within myself, if it's genuinely archetypal, it therefore overlaps through some secret or occult system of correspondences with that image within everyone else. And so I am a great manipulator. I am a sorcerer. I can pull up the image from this perspective of the thing, excite the emotional response, and by doing so, activate that image within everyone else and excite the response within them. And so Culianu is a very interesting author, Ioan Culianu, in his previously mentioned book, Eros and Magic in the Renaissance, because he comes in and says, quite interestingly, given that he was shot dead by the Securitate, he posits that great manipulators of images, Neoplatonic sorcery type folks of the Giordano Bruno stripe, are in fact the direct ancestors of today's hacks and flacks, journalists, ad men, and propagandists. Sort of like if you want to find the much more capable and conscious version of an Edward Bernays, you have to look back to a Giordano Bruno. So this whole idea of the art of memory has a very complex psychology that goes with it. And to understand that, you should probably look at Culianu, because he goes back and traces it through like Stoic theories of the pneuma and all sorts of other things like that, and presents the reader with a picture of the logic, if you will, underlying this whole approach. So with the Renaissance, you have the emergence of the great manipulator, of the one who had this magical power. And remember the whole thing about architecture. Never forget that this whole thing that we're discussing is inextricably tied up with architecture, going back to the ancient world, ancient Greece, the Hellenic period, Rome, late antiquity and the fall of the Roman Empire, the emergence of Christianity, early Christianity, the 12th century industrial revolution, and the emergence of scholastic thinking, the Renaissance after that, straight up through to the end of the Renaissance and the beginning of the Enlightenment. The art of memory is very much a part of everything that had to do with architecture, if the architect had received any real training in his tradition. You can see it reflected even among people into recondite old subjects much later. All you have to do is read Victor Hugo's Hunchback of Notre Dame and hear how he talks about medieval Paris, which had very much disappeared by the 19th century. A lot of it had been torn down, and he lamented that. And as he talks about Notre Dame and the way the city used to be laid out before that, it's very clear that Hugo knew about the art of memory. But he was one of those very few in that sort of 19th century wasteland in which so much was flattened out with industrialization and all these other changes, you know, the emergence of a more and more aggressive universal secular humanism. But architecture was very much a part of all of this. And with the disappearance of these ideas, they kind of peter out. There are figures like Petrus Ramus. I believe he's French, late 1500s, known for coming up with systems to schematize and order all knowledge, but they're very binary. They're like a sort of linear arrangement of forking paths. You can really see the emergence of the dialectic with the emergence of Ramus. What happens to the art of memory, at least Francis Yates argues this, during the period of the Enlightenment, is that it becomes very much systematized, schematized. It gets tied more deeply to text and textual organization, and ultimately to what I was talking about before, forking sort of binary paths. Either it is or it is not. You lose that sort of gestalt that comes with pulling up a memory image. You know, if you're trying to understand virtue and vice, and you use an image from like the Dream of Scipio, you know, with the classic trope of a path going up a mountainside, and it's steep and rugged and difficult, but the other path runs down smoothly and without any hindrance or obstacle into rolling green pastures. You know, that's the idea of virtue and vice. By thinking of that image, you have the idea of struggle and difficulty and being at a peak, versus the easiness where you roll down with gravity without any obstacles, but there are no challenges. And so how does it make you stronger? That's what an image does. But when you flatten that down into text and you make that text binary, it's much like, for example, the true and false tests that we give to children in schools, I think still today, if they give to children any tests at all anymore. But when I was a kid, you know, they'd give you true and false tests. And it's much less important whether or not a given thing happened to be true or happened to be false. What was most important about those tests is that they trained successive generations to assume that anything was susceptible to be being dubbed true or false. What if it's both true and false? What if true and false are not subtle enough to grasp the different aspects that might come with an image, but that don't work well in this linear forking path binary kind of crap? What if it's neither true nor false? You know, it's that kind of subtlety immediately goes by the wayside. And there are advantages to it because you no longer can sort of hide in the gray area of some sort of Gnostic understanding. You have to say, okay, scientific method demands that we be able to establish empirically whether a thing is true or false. And so we got lots of great advantages. I don't want to go back in time to where there's no modern dentistry, to where we don't have computers, where I can't like talk here at my house digitally through a window to, you know, all the crazy people who might be listening. But in exchange for whatever it was that we gained by the whole true false binary forking path kind of thing, it brings to mind that Borges story about the Garden of Forking Paths. But whatever it is we gained by it, we certainly lost something. And that was the idea that these images are four-dimensional within us. It's not just the image that you can call up, it's how it moves or changes over time. In short, we sort of lost the idea, which is why I had to explain all of this in the first place at the outset. We lost the idea that the memory is really one way of viewing or experiencing the soul and the character, the self with a capital S. The memory instead has been relegated to the status of sort of a dumping ground of the unconscious, you know, post-Freudian idea. And this is something Mary Carruthers goes into. The memory is this thing that's really just kind of tied to the imagination. You know, as Carruthers discusses, you know, the brilliant man of the past would have been said to have a great memory, and would go to into his or her memory in order to receive inspiration, or what they would have called invention, the influx of the spiritus, meaning breath, vent like household vent, or convention, to breathe together. Invention was the influx of spiritus, breath or spirit, because they were not distinguished. And one would experience periods of invention through recourse to one's memory, and would have greater or lesser success at it based on how ordered and full and accurate that memory was. Because remember, the idea was to have things that were true in a theological sense and moral sense as the basis of one's memory, which is to say one's character, which is to say one's soul. It would be populated with these images. Now, again, I'm talking about artificial memory. I'll leave it to folks such as Tim to speak at greater length, perhaps another time, about the natural memory and how these things relate. But that's no longer what we have. We have the idea, instead of a memory, we call it the imagination. And it is certainly not Henry Corbin's imaginal. It's merely imaginary. It is something that therefore isn't real. It's the place of fantasy, and it's a mess. It's like a swamp. We might be able to reach back into it, remember something, and maybe we can't. We don't know, because we don't bother with all of that. Knowledge is externalized. It's not in our memory. We just go to our black mirror and we gaze into it as though John Dee scrying. Except in this case, we're fucking trapped by the demon and ensorcelled by looking in the black mirror, because our memory's all out here, which means we're empty. We're like these dry husks ready to be blown about, because we have not consciously, intentionally, systematically, and methodically formed our own memories, which is to say formed our own characters, which is to say cultivated our own souls, by planting the seeds within us, so that there is a space within us that is real, where we carry something that can't be taken from us, which is our moral knowledge, our theological knowledge, everything that is experiential, that informs who and what we are. It's all gone. So that's one of the prices that we've paid in moving to an age where we've forgotten much of this. Now, there's a last piece. This is something that Frances Yates goes into quite a bit in several of her books, because there's others besides Giordano Bruno on the Hermetic tradition and the art of memory. There's stuff on Elizabethan esotericism. I should be able to recite all these books by name, but I'm fucking old and I can't remember all of them. And there's also stuff on, there's Rosicrucian Enlightenment and some other ones. Basically what happened was, when science was coming to the fore, you had this weird sort of last gasp of esotericism with people like Robert Flood, or we don't like to remember it today, but many people know that Isaac Newton spent a whole lot more time studying alchemy. Leibniz, a lot of these figures got involved in esoterica, but it was like the last gasp. And then the 18th and 19th centuries rolled in, and you had steamships and projectile weapons and textile mills, and nobody wanted to create vast, sprawling memorial palaces within themselves. So anyway, this is a very, very superficial treatment across what everybody should understand is a vast span of time. And I've tried to tap a few things in different directions. Before we move to me looking to see if there are any questions I might be able to answer towards the end of this, I want to cover, and also going over the books. Yeah, that's what I'll do. I want to cover some a few points on why all of this is interesting. I mean, besides all the different ways, at least as far as I'm concerned, I've already shown that it's interesting and worth everyone's attention. It's the core of our cultural memory, and yet we have forgotten our culture. So what could be more important for recovering that culture than understanding the art of memory, or more accurately, the arts of memory, the artes memorative, that once formed the foundation of all public speaking, of literature, of cultivation of the soul, of religion, all there in the background, and yet completely forgotten. People don't recognize them when they walk past a Gothic cathedral. They're literally looking at an attempt of a whole group of people to take an interior memory castle and bring this damn thing to life in space. Just absolutely awe-inspiring. But Before we get to the books, I'm going to cover some of these points, as I said, and then we'll go to questions and see how that works out. I expect I want to try to keep this under 2 hours, or right around 2 hours, which would mean we'd cut out at 11:45, I believe. Okay, so one of the things that I think bears on why all of this is interesting is it showed us, as I said, it's a system of how things were remembered in the absence of widespread literacy. Now, we can all, think today, oh yes, we're all wonderfully literate, but I got a question earlier tonight from the great order. I mean, he was half joking, but he was asking me about emojis and why they're becoming important, as a form of communication. And just look at like LOL and OMG and TFW, all this crap, these reductions of the scope of this wonderful tool written language that we have. I think it's possible to argue that we should pay attention to the art of memory because it will show us potentially certain ways that people would have to go if they wanted to continue to remember and communicate without written language. Because I would argue that though literacy is now much more widespread, it is absolutely just the top layer. It's a sticky crust on the surface of reality. They barely get deep down into anything at all. And so examining ways in the past that people remembered and communicated things in the absence of writing might be useful to us today. Another thing is the idea of Freemasons. Everyone's like, oh, the Freemasons are great manipulators. I touched on this before. It has to do with them making buildings. That's where the Thomas Marcus book, Buildings and Power, Freedom and Control, and the Origin of Modern Building Types comes up. If you know about the art of memory, then that becomes twice as interesting, because what you see with the 18th century, mostly Protestant, social engineering building codes and great building programs, the emergence of debtors' prisons, hospitals, poorhouses, panopticons, and all the rest, that was an attempt to shape society with buildings based on reason, but those structures weren't inspired and drawn fully from our heritage with the classical world. They were instead the products of reason. We'll make a panopticon because we'll have one point at the center, because mathematically, the center point of a circle allows us to gaze outwards at all the points on the circumference. So reason informed the interior images, which were then made manifest in this Protestant social engineering building program. But before that, arguably, Freemasons and others, straight Masons, were involved in, all the way back to Vitruvius, were involved in trying to shape culture through programs of building. And with the art of memory, you can kind of knit all of that together in ways that would otherwise not make any sense to you. So you can also look at classical and medieval architecture with new eyes. I mean, Tim knows this story very well, and I may have even mentioned it in a stream once here in the past. But unless you know about the art of memory, then there's so much that's going to escape you. That same visit to Florence, when I went to the villa at Careggi, that had been one of Marsilio Ficino's haunts given to him by the Medicis to occupy. I also went to the Medici Palace in Florence. So there's probably more than one, but I only remember it as the Medici Palace. I'd have to do some research to tell you the exact location, but there's an interior courtyard, and I was there in I think 93, and I was kind of wandering through, taking photographs of things, and I stopped to change out a roll of film, and then sat down to repack stuff in my camera bag and everything, and I was sitting in this little circular area, and I looked around, and there were multiple statues around the periphery of this circle, and I was like, oh, no, man. So I put my camera away, stood up, went to the center of the circle, which had a geometric pattern there. And then I turned and realized that each one of those statues was facing me and looking dead at me, but you had to be standing in the center of the circle, and you'd have to turn to each one in turn to recognize that they'd been positioned with eyes carved and everything to look as though they're looking at you. Until you got to the last figure in my sequence anyway. Depending on where you start, I imagine it could be in the middle or the end or the beginning. But for me, it was the last one I came to, which was fitting because it was a figure holding a winged egg and looking straight up at the heavens, not at me. So one of them I think was like a Hercules figure. I can't remember. I'd have to pull out the old prints. But the idea is you had these figures laid out. And if you understand the art of memory, you could understand that that was a spot that a member of the family could come and meditate. And over the years, that would be fixed as a set of images and would tell a story about how the final figure with the winged egg, some sort of philosophy or maybe Urania or something, is looking up away from the world of men because these affairs don't bear. But these other virtues represented by the statues would also be internalized and again become part of the character, become part of the soul, and shape the moral and ethical framework that informed everything that person did. So again, it will allow us to look at medieval and classical architecture with new eyes, and at the inexplicable non-architecture of today. As soon as you apply the art of memory to it, it's exposed as the blush, spackled horse stink it is. It has no order to it. It has no logic. It's the creation of insane people. These giant big box stores with these flat facades, these buildings that are literally meaningless. It's the triumph of the warehouse. The idea of a building designed to do nothing more than to hold the maximum amount possible, with no internal ordering, with no structure, with no social distinctions instantiated in the structure. By understanding the art of memory and what used to inform our architecture, the idea that we would take structures from within the soul of the builder and place them outside in order to provide archetypes that would shape the appearance of imagined or memorialized structures within, that's all disappeared. And now it's just tin pot Potemkin villages of like smut and convenience. Those things, the horror show that we inhabit today is revealed more starkly. It helps to wipe the makeup off the corpse, and we can begin to recognize the nature of the stink that surrounds us architecturally. And I guess another last piece is that we can use our understanding of all of this as a way to seek to make architecture more meaningful again. And this comes around to my discussion of stuff about the house, about the perfect institution for a grassroots movement of retaking control of our institutions. The first step to that is to restore the primary institution of civil society, which is our houses, that form the basis of extending family wisdom and knowledge across time. Imagine if you yourself designed your home so it had built into it one sort of puzzling feature that was experienced architecturally. You came in and there's a front door and it splits two ways, and you had one door frame is white and one is black. Now, I wouldn't recommend that because that's more like Rainism and binary stuff, but I'm doing it because it's a simple example. You would then, be able to tell your child when he reached 10 years of age that there was a real, or her age, that there was a real reason that you had built the house that way for him or her, so that they would always remember that they stand on this threshold and they can go left or right through the white doorway or the black one. You can move forward with that and become more articulate, as it were, with your architectural communications, with your memorial communications, if you can see more. And then you can see more, you can instantiate it further and share it further with members of your family. Because, as I mentioned before in previous streams, and not all of us are going to have the money, I certainly don't, to go out and try to create some big, beautiful building, that is a way to memorialize the structures within my soul or memory, but I can shape my house and thereby shape the character and souls of the family members I raise within it. So that's the last little piece. Now, 100 other ways this could go. I'm just going to go over the books now with you quickly, and then we should have a little bit of time for questions. I want to try not to meander too much with this, because as a live stream, I want this to still hold interest for people coming later. I realize I kind of almost had a tire blowout there at the beginning with getting the video working and everything, but hopefully I'll stay fairly focused with this. So let's go through these books really quickly. The classic that I started with, and therefore I kind of think everybody should start with, is The Art of Memory by Francis Yates. I literally wore out my first copy of this. This, I believe, is a UK edition of it that I ordered in Turkey. when I was there because my first one got worn out or stolen. Book thieves. This is the classic. But the thing is that it focuses on antiquity and the classical world, and then jumps straight to the Renaissance, and then goes further up in time. And it kind of jumps over the Middle Ages. I mean, she discusses it somewhat, or at a fair length, but that's a big weakness of hers in that book. And I say that with all respect because she's a great pioneer. But that weakness, thankfully, was made up or was addressed by a woman named Mary Carruthers, another great scholar, and again, a woman. So if you ever want to bitch about female scholars, man, I take my hat off to Frances Yates and Mary Carruthers, the woman who came in and covered the medieval period. This is Cambridge, The Book of Memory by Mary Carruthers. This one I'd read first. This is dense stuff if you're not used to academic reading, but well worth it. This is The Craft of Thought, another book on medieval memory by Mary Carruthers. And this is an anthology of texts and pictures called The Medieval Craft of Memory. This is also by Mary Carruthers. Odd how the bull there has a city, so to speak, within its mind, which is to say within its soul. Interesting. There's also by Ivan Illich, In the Vineyard of the Text. He's not so much a guy big into the art of memory, but he's aware of the work of people like Yates. This isn't like a great classic, but it's very useful dimensionalization of all of this. He discusses Hugh of St. Victor's Didascalion, as does Carruthers in various spots. There's another one that I've only partially read, but it's a great classic. I think it dates from the period or shortly before the period of Yates's book. So this was a real pioneer. This is Logic and the Art of Memory by Paolo Rossi. I believe it was originally published in Italian. That's University of Chicago Press. And what I mentioned earlier is the older Sophists. This is not going to be so much for the art of memory. It's just, it was really interesting to look through it because it's all these tiny little vestiges of sort of everything that came before. Well, I mean, you have the Iliad and the Odyssey, and you have Hesiod, you know, works and days and Theogony. But basically, there's just this sort of stuff right here, these tiny fragments, other than, you know, some stuff on pre-Socratic, which really should be pre-Platonic philosophers, and those Stoics. That's all you really have between Hesiod and Homer and the appearance of Plato. All right, and then just because it's good to look over some other things, this is the Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci. This is about a Jesuit who traveled to the East, eventually arriving in China. And in the late 1500s, he attempted to teach a memory system based on memory palaces to members of the Chinese court so that they could more effectively pass an imperial exam, you know, covering all the knowledge that they as mandarins must possess. And as I recall, he had some exciting times getting involved in all of that. There's another one called The Mind of a Mnemonist. This is important. This is by Luria. This is a psychological consideration by this I think a Russian psychologist, and he basically gets with this guy who's famous for having an incredible memory, and it turns out, and this is contemporary more or less, 20th century, and it turns out that the very techniques used instinctively by this mnemonist are basically the art of memory, but this person had no training in that, and yet used those very techniques to perform these seemingly miraculous feats. And it's good to read that one because it's referred to by Carruthers in her book, The Book of Memory. And just because I am who I am, I also wanted to look at other traditions. So this is The Mirror of Memory. It's a collection of Buddhist texts on memory. I would only recommend looking into this kind of stuff very, very late. But it's only when you begin to look further and wider that you understand how Western and uniquely Western our traditions are. Because we can say that memory is part of forming character or the soul, but what happens when you go look at Buddhist ideas of memory? How does that work in terms of how they view ontology and epistemology, the basis of knowledge and being? It's kind of weird because they hold that there is no true self. It's easy for us to say that, well, where's the memory? Oh, that's easy, in the soul. to which we have access because it's the primal ground of us manifesting as ourselves. But in Buddhism, there's no such idea that there's an individual soul like that, or if there is, it's illusory. So tackling this text is rather interesting because you keep running into these spots where it's kind of weird. You're like, well, wait a minute, but this doesn't presume a distinct and unique individual self, and yet it tries to account for memory and one's own memory, if it can be called one's own. Anyway, so there's a general run of books that you can follow up and use to learn, follow up with and use to learn more about this. I wanted to bring this up because Tim mentioned in one of our previous clips that he would like to talk further about the art of memory, and that it's the only thing he's really actually interested in telling other people about. I think he's, you know, he has one failing, and that is indulging me too much. So he basically puts up with all my questions and answers these things that we discuss in our various clips. But I take it as meaning that I should never assume simply because he will discuss them with me that he really cares all that much about him. As he often says, I don't give a fuck. But he is interested in the art of memory. And if we're going to talk about this further, I thought it would be useful to go through all of this and kind of give an introduction to the subject. Now, if you dug this discussion, then at a minimum, you will probably want to take a look at the other clip I did in the Mark series that I think I mentioned early at the outset of this clip. It's called Memory Mark, or the Mark of Memory. I'll link it eventually at the end of this clip. You know, this will go live, and then I'll have to make a thumbnail for it, and then I can, you know, put some slates at the end for videos you can link to. So, you know, within a day of this being posted, I'll get the linked clips at the end. And by watching this and checking out the Mark of Memory or Memory Mark and the other ones in that Mark series, because they all kind of relate, having to do with space, non-linguistic communication, you will be better prepared for whatever it is Tim may grace us with in terms of discussions along these lines. I mean, if nothing else, you'll have a background for him telling me, you know, how all of it was wrong, you know, or what it is I may have missed with all of this. So that is the main run here. For those of you who want to boogie, I'm just going to be taking questions now at the end. So I am not in a position to really scroll upwards to look back through them. I mean, I'll take a quick look at it. But for those of you who have questions for me, please do the thing of putting an @Semiagog at the beginning so they stand out sharply for me. And I will take a look here and attempt to answer questions that you have until my cutoff point, which is 11:45. So bring them to us, ladies and gentlemen. And also, please hit the like button. Please hit the like. It helps me out when you do that. And also, if you are a subscriber, please check to make sure you are still subscribed. Lots of people are being knocked off now and being unsubscribed without wanting to be. It's just, you know, that time of year again with YouTube, I guess. So, do we have any questions here? Ladies and gentlemen, anything about the art of memory? Let's keep the discussion on the art of memory. I'm going to look up here and see if there are any questions here that will apply in the meantime while I'm waiting for you guys to plug in questions. 20 minutes left, ladies and gentlemen. Share your questions if you have. I am now looking to see, we have mind mapping. Yes, there are any number of ways in which our current trends and fashionable approaches reflect this older and deeper thing. What else? We have Possert talking about being in a home without a hearth. Yes, there's a reason why it's the center of the home, and you'll find out about it if the electricity goes out. Wanadosis says @Semiagog, so Jordan Peterson is right. I don't know about all that. I have heard a friend of mine got his book Maps of Meaning, which I thought might have something to do with the art of memory, and from everything I can tell, it doesn't. All right, I'm still looking through here. I'll go check down at the bottom, see if we got any questions. Here we do. Wandosis says I had a real good question that I forgot. Maybe I already hit it. JR asks, Semiagog, what culture do you think still has the setup, home, and community and family down the best? Maybe the Georgians, Amish. I don't know anything about Georgian culture, but from what I've heard from friends who visited Tbilisi, I don't know why you would single them out as being exemplary. Maybe there's something I'm missing. I think everybody's kind of been screwed. I don't know enough about the Amish, really, but they have so thoroughly grasped the Christian perspective and a particular view of it that I don't know how much room there is for all this classical kind of stuff that I'm talking about. And they do that thing where they let their kids run off and be wild if they want to, and then come back. And I understand that they don't have that great a deal of success with all of it. So whomever it is that has the best setup for home, community, and family, and I'm not sure really anybody does. I'd have to give it some thought. Maybe the Hungarians, they're clearly trying to do some things collectively. But I wouldn't, Georgians and Amish wouldn't immediately pop in my mind. Zed Des says, question posed earlier. I would like to know more about your intentio origin interest in this subject. Tim was the first one who presented it to me, and I was into esoterica and magic and all of that kind of thing. And Tim kind of laughed at me. I mean, I was a kid at that point. And he was like, have you heard about the art of memory? Have you heard about Giordano Bruno? So for me, it was at first an attempt to like find this deeper, older, more primal current of not just magic, but and not just esoterica, but all of knowledge and meaning and learning in the ancient world. I don't know. That's really the thing that struck me. But then once you begin to play with this, it's so central to everything in Western culture. I mean, that's why even though I wasn't right wing by any stretch, I mean, the only fundamentally right wing thing for me when I was younger was that I was, I thought everybody should carry guns, but otherwise. And I, looked at people as coming from cultures and having a background, not being globally interchangeable. But otherwise, it was all, what you'd call today libertarian or, I mind my business, you should too, fuck off. But once you embrace this whole thing with the art of memory and culture and architecture representing the interiority, everywhere you go, you look at the buildings and you're like, wow, these people very kindly externalize their souls for me. So I can look at how their culture is organized based on what they built and how they built it. So it's kind of, once you really start digging into it, it's just kind of hard to put down. So that's the best I can answer the question. Zedes, philosophicat, however that works, did confirm my suspicion, which is maps of meaning is more about mythology. Nick Face. Last time I asked concerning the primal mark left in space in all phenomena, do you think this supports the notion that despite any manipulation of symbols, the essence remains for R2M? Man, I think I'm just coming out of the wormhole of talking about the art of memory, but I'm, for whatever reason, for R2M is not, it's opaque to me. So restate that. So even someone like, speak simply so I can understand and I'll try to answer. Caster28 asks, what are the current trend of the left in rewriting Western history, memory? Yeah, and notice how they do it. They try to knock down statues in space. Knocking down a statue in space is simply plucking the image out of its loci. And when you do that, you've removed it from memory. See, that's the thing. We have ways of understanding this today that don't require recourse to the art of memory as an explanatory model. But if you recognize that this was intentionally how we did shit to remember things all the way back through history, then, what they're doing is baldly exposed for the social engineering deconstruction that it is. So, yeah, I don't know how many of them are really knowledgeable about the art of memory. Most of them get lost in textual games like Derrida, sort of postmodern Kabbalistic, in quotes, rearrangements of letters. The leftists, being academics and therefore being textually trained in sort of post-scholastic traditions, they're actually shockingly weak with non-linguistic communication. And I only learned this by trying to go into academia to talk about marks and signs. And if you look at like memory mark and the other 3 videos, beast mark and memory and merchant mark, beast mark, memory mark, merchant mark, all of that was the product of me going and trying to deal with academia and talk to them about my ideas with images in space and non-linguistic communication. And I have to tell you, they don't know much about it. If the right wing really wants to steal a march with a whole body of knowledge that most of the POMO leftists don't even want to touch because they can't see it. They're so trapped in the text, right? Remember, these are the people who think that if you change the word for a thing, you'll change culture. They live in the text. It's like that line from the Tao, the net of words may bind, how surely truth slips out. If there's some aspect of human knowledge that the right should reclaim, it's the use of marks, signs, symbols, and the art of memory. And that is, of course, why they have created the archetype of the right-wing people as the one who have symbols like swastikas or iron crosses, and they demonize it. The use of symbols like that is in and of itself sort of questionable at the outset. Wow, they got flags and banners with these symbols on them that aren't, letters or just a simple picture. That means they must be suspect. It's because there is a whole dimension of this that they want to reject. And I mean, there's a whole lot more that could be discussed on that level, but maybe that's enough for the moment. Mr. Ixme asks, where'd it go? Damn it. It just slipped out. Do you have a basic organizing principle for your memory palace? The strategy for adding on over time without creating a jumble? Well, I'm working on some stuff with alphabets. Remember at the beginning, I mentioned that you didn't have to use a building. You could create imaginary places, as Frances Yates discusses, and she shows how Giordano Bruno took over a technique referred to in antiquity used by a guy named Metrodorus of Skepsis. And I actually went to ancient Paleo-Skepsis, where he would have come from, and climbed up on top of the hill of ancient Paleo-Skepsis. I wrote the article on Metrodorus of Skepsis in Wikipedia. I wrote most of the article in Wikipedia on the art of memory. And for a time, I lived in Old Kadikoi, which was Chalcedon, which was the part of Byzantium where Metrodorus of Skepsis lived before he ran into some trouble, becoming a judge and confidant of Mithridates Eupator. Anyway, that path just intertwines with my own intentionally because I went and explored it. Metrodorus of Skepsis was said to have organized his memory system with interlocking units of the zodiac somehow arranged in wheels. And then you get stuff with like Ramon Yule, Lullism, Eulism, which is the idea of combinatorics with concentric wheels with letters on them. I mean, there are various ways you can do it. You can do it with buildings, you can do it with alphabets, whatever lays down an order. And because you've got a backwards and forwards order, like, I had to go through this whole thing of learning to recite the alphabet forwards and backwards and break it up into chunks and rearrange it in different forms. And I can now do that in my mind's eye. And then I'm tying each of those letters to a word, right? So A is for apple and Z is for Zen in one of my systems. And then I know that Z reattaches to A because there's an archer in the tree, a Zen archer under Zen who's shooting back to hit the apple, kind of like William Tell for A at the beginning. There are all kinds of ways it's knit together. Memory flourishes with brevity. It delights in brevity and order. So the main principle you have to understand is to have small sets, never more than 12. And, 3 to 5, 5 to 12, right in there, that range. And then always have subdivisions and make sure this stuff is emotionally striking and keep clear space. In the art of memory, you'll read about how images, in the Renaissance, they talk about, a figure who's got the hand up in the air and one off to one side, showing the amount of space that should be around an image so that it doesn't connect to other images and remains distinct. There's a lot in the texts, if you read them, that will help you to address that idea of how to keep it orderly and neat. Phoenix Fire 108 asks, besides oratory traditions, what effects do you think musical traditions have on memory? You think it could build a type of memory? Yeah, the issue is finding a way to anchor it, which is why so many people struggled for so long to come up with systems of musical notation. Where I have really hit a hard wall is systems of dance notation. But yeah, you can look at the Guidonian hand, for example. I mean, even do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. is a mnemonic, do, a deer, a female deer, ray, a pocket full of sun. It's a mnemonic to hold it down and hold the sequence. So there's lots of stuff like that. I mean, when they're trying to teach you about perfect pitch and the rest, you'll have the idea of associating a note with a color. There are many ways people have attempted it. And as soon as you get into the Renaissance and later Hermeticists like Robert Fludd, they're all over music, because music has the idea of the music of the spheres and Pythagoreanism. And yeah, you're not going to find any shortage of attempts, at least from the Renaissance forward, to juxtapose mnemonics and music. Adherent of Lady Columbia asks, I've noticed the 30-year cycle in art is as a consequence of losing memory. I don't know enough about that to answer, I'm sorry to say. Patrick Doiron says, what do you think of the idea that monuments are ancient technology that marks the etheric landscape of an area, thus affecting the culture of a place, hence the monument destruction? Well, that's kind of like, ley lines and Rosalind's Chapel meets feng shui. Yes, there are definitely arguments for that. And I think there is enough to that it's not all a bunch of bullshit. But it has never been an area that I myself have focused on. So I can't really speak intelligently about it. That might be something that Tim could opine on, because I know he's paid attention to what could be called the energy of a place. He's certainly not into feng shui. But in my experience, he's spent some time thinking about those subjects. I mean, he talked to me when I came back from Stockholm, and I was like, man, I was all fucked up. And he's like, yeah, there's lots of granite there, man. Electromagnetism there, lots of iron and stone. It's a very different field radiating off of the earth that you inhabit. So it's easy to go from that to, magnetism, electromagnetism, and, hell, it was Tim who talked to me about how essentially you've got the crust of the earth, which has all kinds of carbon in it, which we call things like coal and the rest. And there's all kinds of copper. And we talk about how the crust floats over the mantle. The mantle floats over the core, or some sort of arrangement of that sort. And basically you've got copper and carbon rubbing together. So you've got, layers that are much like a generator with the brushes. So yeah, there's something to that, but I don't know enough about it. JR asks, does Apollonialism have anything in relation to your theory on the importance of the home? That is, the perennial Mediterranean family culture versus the Protestant Faustian ethos leading to today. Wow. That's coming from 100 different directions, or at least 4 or 5. I want to answer your question because clearly it's one you've thought through, but I would have to go through. We've got 5 minutes left, and I'd have to get into defining Apollonianism. Are you talking about Dionysian versus Apollonian in like the sense of Nietzsche, or is it simply sun and order versus dissolution in a more primal sense? So I'm sorry, I can't answer that one. G asks, what do you think of the practicality of creating these environments in virtual space models for VR? I thought about that a lot as a kid in like the early 90s as the internet began to appear. And people don't remember that before there was Oculus Rift, there was this whole thing called VRML instead of HTML. And it was supposed to be virtual reality. And I had this whole idea that I would get together and model in 3D the various circles of Dante's Inferno and Purgatorio and Paradiso, which were certainly a memory palace. You start to read literature, as I said, the book becomes the place where the memory palace is made. That's another thing about the art of memory, is it opens up all these old texts and reveals to you what these guys were doing. If you had internalized the structure of Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, you had a Renaissance Italian model of the entire sort of world of theology at your fingertips, in your mind, imprinted on your soul. All right. Posture asks, am I closer to a rifle decision? Only in the sense that I've dispensed with all these fancy things like blackout and, Creedmoor and the rest. I'm just going straight with the 308. I'm going to get a 5.56 and a 308. That's it. All right. Well, we're coming up on the end here, just a few minutes left. I do not see any last questions that I can grasp with. I look like a Ruger guy. I got a Ruger. My first revolver was a Ruger. They make them. They're like tanks. Tim pointing me towards them because he's like, you get a 357 and you can put thousands of rounds through it and it won't wear out. But they've got a lot of those MIM cast parts. They're very heavy. So I kind of like Smith & Wessons more now as revolvers. The problem is the quality of the Smith & Wessons has gone down. Okay, you see, now you got me off on gun talk again, damn it. We've got 3 minutes left. Well, I don't know if Tim is still in the house. Hopefully I have not embarrassed him too much, since he guided me through this process for quite some time. In this case, rather than talking about my patrons, I will say to Tim goes all of the credit and none of the blame. What do I think subterranean architecture would be like in relation to memory from Adherent of Lady Columbia? I don't know. The only subterranean architecture that I have seen is in my dreams, but I know that there's a lot with the Cave of the Nymphs as described in Porphyry, and there's a whole bunch with like grottos as mystic places that you find in reference to the spirits that go with streams of water, nymphs and naiads and the rest, and you see it appear again in some fashion in the period of the Hellfire Club and the esotericism of that period. There's lots of stuff left over from that period in England, grottos and caves where all kinds of debauchery took place, but I'm not really in a position to say much about it. But Ace Piltow mentions catacombs. That's one place where you see it. If you look at the medieval stuff, you'll see huge diagrams, like as a memory palace, one of the hues, it's either one of the fellows of St. Victor, either Hugh or Richard, I think it's Hugh of St. Victor, has the whole map of the Ark of Noah as a memory palace to help you grasp all sorts of Christian lore and learning. All right, we are coming up on the end. I could go on quite a bit longer. I will be talking to Tim at least as early as this Tuesday and recording new stuff, maybe on the subject of being black-pilled, something I want to talk to him about if he is up for it. I've also got one coming up in the next few days that I'm going to record on the House, another clip in the House series, which will be on intergenerational dialogue and fostering, that will go in that whole House sequence. You guys should have a new source of information on the art of memory now that you can explore. Please remember to follow A Safer Space, the alternate channel. Please remember to head over to BitChute, because God knows what the hell is going to happen with YouTube soon, because there are analogs for both channels over there. Please subscribe. Everybody's going over there now. Please remember to resubscribe here, because lots of people are being booted without wanting to. Follow me on Minds, Twitter, Discord server, BitChute, and all the rest. And thank you, all of you, for joining me tonight for this live stream. I know it was a little bit long-winded, but hopefully there is something in there for everyone. The art of memory is very much worth all y'all's attention. Get it? Got it? Good. Thank you, everyone. Semiagog, out.